32 ticks following. So they are swallowing. Monkey is swallowing. Snake self swallowing. Next, a swallow 2 will fly and come and swallow. You're ever swallow in a hollow gallow, making a whole lot of halabaloo. Jale kalu, we know say you chop the money some, so give me the loot. Do you really want a revolution or just your turn?
Hey, Maaza.
Hi, Remy.
How are you doing?
I'm good. It's so good to see you from far away. We should have been acting.
Yeah, we should have been, but you know, the way the world is right now, yeah, this is the best we can do. But I'm still so excited to still be sitting here with you, talking about your wonderful book.
Wow, I've been looking forward to it for a long time.
Yeah, and I have to start off with something weird. This weird we're talking in 2020 because I first encountered your first book in 2010. This is like 10 years ago. I was in Cape Town. I was studying English literature, and I think one of my professors came up to me and said, I think you should look at this book. You might like it.
Oh, wow.
And I remember encountering for the first time. I was in Cape Town. It was during the World Cup. And I was like, yeah, I'll look at it. And then I only looked at it. I only read it towards the end of that year. And then look at us, 10 years on.
Oh, my God. How old were you 10 years ago, Remy? That was like, you were 12.
Close.
I'm very honored.
I was 22 and I had no idea what the world was. I had no idea what was happening in my life and what was going to happen in literature. I didn't know in 2020 we'd be sitting like in separate parts of the world because of COVID, having an online chat about this book, about your work. Yeah, how weird is that?
Yes. I mean, it's been an intense year for all of us. But these last 10 years, you know, in between these books, I think it's so much has changed.
A lot has changed. And you know what? One of the things that has got a lot of people through 2020 is this book.
Oh my God.
A lot of people have really enjoyed reading your work and engaging it. And most importantly with you for being so generous about all the processes and challenges you faced in putting the story together. And I thought that would be a wonderful way to start talking about this incredible story.
Yeah, because I think when readers pick up a finished book, they're not, you know, they don't think about everything that it took to get to that point. And for a writer, picking up that book is a completely different experience because when I see that book, I don't really see the finished product. I see all the years and the process it took to get there. So it's a different way to read.
And I have my very first question of the day. Was The Shadow King the first story that you wanted to write, but maybe you didn't have the skill to do it, so you started with The Lion's Gaze? I've heard a lot of authors experience that the first story that comes to their head, they often might not have the experience or skill to write it or the time to write it. And so sometimes their second book is the one that gets published first. And then after they've reached some level of comfort with their skill or with the subject matter at hand, they then write that first idea that came to head. So I wanted to ask if it was like that with you.
Yeah, you know, I remember exactly the year that I woke up one day and I said, I want to write this book. And it was 1999. I don't even know if you were born then, Remy. I was very much an adult, but I wasn't a writer. And I just had this idea that, oh my God, I want to do this story. I want to write about the Ethiopian conflict with Italy, but I was not a writer. I didn't come from a literary family. I didn't come from a literary background. I was an English major in college, but that was it. So it was a little crazy to think that I would even write a book or that I imagined it. I just put it aside, thought about it for a while. And then 5 years down the road, I was applying for a graduate degree to get my master's in creative writing, my master's of fine arts. I thought about this book And I said, there's no way I could do something set in 1935 as a brand new writer. I think I need to look at this other book I have in mind also, which is 1970s revolutionary Ethiopia. I lived during that period in Ethiopia. I remembered some things, and I said, okay, let me try this, figure out how to write a book, and then I'll start thinking about how to work on this other thing that I think will be my second book. So it's been, more than 10 years. I think it's been 20 years, we could say, since I first thought of The Shadow King in a completely different form. But that book really began in 99 with a thought.
Yeah. I think if you talk about this book having been in your head for close to 20 years, I can understand why it has reached this stage and why it is the way it is. I mean, when a story burrows that deeply into you and you're thinking about it every day or, for weeks at a time, the story, I think, just becomes richer. And I think it comes out in your book because this book is well thought out. It's got minute details that I, as a young writer, would not think about when I'm writing. And I just wanted to ask, during those 20 years, which this book is in your conception, it's in your mind and you're trying to structure it and whatnot, what did you have to learn first in order to bring the first couple of words to the page?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question, Remy. I want to clarify, 20 years ago, I was only 2 years old. But thinking about the things that the book took many forms before its final form. The first thing I think I was thinking of were the battles, because how do you write a war without the battles? The conflict was the major thing for me initially. I was thinking of the confrontation on a battlefield between Italian soldiers and Ethiopian soldiers. And I thought, I'm going to write this first. I'm going to do this. And I need a leader for the Ethiopians. I need a leader for the Italians. And they're going to be facing each other off. If it didn't begin this way, it would be very early on. And I would have a book that was battle after battle after battle until Ethiopia won. Because those are the stories I heard growing up, were these stories of defiance, of determination, of heroism on the part of the Ethiopians. And I wanted to reflect that. You can imagine those early pages were just horrible. They were stilted, they were dry, they were caricatures of what we imagine war to be. You and I have talked about Gladiator, which is our favorite movie, one of them.
Yes.
So here I am thinking I'm going to create Gladiator, in every battle. I'm going to do it like this film. And
there's going to be an epic speech every 5 minutes.
Every 5 minutes. And so you can imagine, I did several chapters like this. I said, actually, didn't they rest? And what did they do while they rested? What was it like? If you're brave, you have to be at some point just so scared out of your mind. That impetus for courage has to come from a moment of fear. So how do I do that? And what are they afraid of? And what's happening? And so slowly the story started getting more complicated. But I wrote a draft, and it took about 5 years to get to that. And I finished it. And it was a very large mess. It was terrible, awful. And I knew that what I had written was something I would never want to read. I could barely bring myself to read that draft. And we can get into it, but this process of putting that down and then finding it really bad was, I think, one of the most demoralizing moments for me as a writer, because I had nobody to blame but myself.
But I mean, in what you just said, you just touched on an important thing, that we often think about war as this just continuous timeline of fight. But as you said, there has to be a pause. Someone has to sleep. Someone has to eat. There has to be conversation. Someone shares a cigarette with someone. And then in The Shadow King, there there are sometimes disturbing moments of intimacy, of some instances where it's quite disturbing, but you understand why it's structured that way. I'd like to know how, after you produced this draft, how you went about choosing your specific moments of intimacy or common humanity, I guess, because regardless of which side you're on, I found some very touching portrayals of humanity, common humanity, things that you and me do on an ordinary Sunday or Saturday, like making a cup of coffee, having a conversation with a friend, and these people are doing it in a life and death situation. So once you produce this horrible manuscript, how did you go about choosing the bits and parts that made the people people?
Well, after I did this manuscript and said, I can't publish this, it's really bad, I sent a panicked message to my editor and basically just said, please, I need to meet with you, and she said, okay, come in my office. So I met with her and she said, I just have a few questions to ask you, but the first question is, whose story is this and why do they want to tell this story? And something clicked with that simple question, because when I went back and looked at it, it wasn't really anyone's story. It was just a series of battles. And I thought, okay, I know I've written down all these historical events, but who cares? Why does it matter? And I went home and started thinking about that, and it clicked for me at some point, thinking about some of the research I've done. I said, I've seen some things here and there about women. Let me look up some stuff. And I started looking through old notes and looking at things I had saved, and there were women on the battlefield. And then, quite literally in my head was like, this is Hirut's story. And the minute I decided that, I said, everything has to change in this book. And I got rid of that draft, completely threw it away. And I opened up a blank sheet of paper. And it took me 2 or 3 days of just staring at it before I felt like I could even put a word down, because I told myself, you have to write this absolutely fearlessly. You have to write this in a way that you've never written anything else before. What would you do if you could do anything you wanted? Who are the writers that have inspired you? What have they done? And why aren't you doing it?
Yeah.
But as soon as I started centering Hirut, it really is when this book started taking shape, because like you said, it moved from, just basically recording historical events to following a human being on that path. And that's when those intimate moments came, because if you talk about women in war, you suddenly shift the conversation to understanding the vulnerabilities that women face, not only, let's say, on a battlefield where they might be soldiers, but also the way that they are territory, the same way that land is. Whenever a land, a country, a village, a town is invaded by somebody from the outside, they go for the women first, because to attack the women is to attack the men. It's also to attack the future generations that can be born from those women. And we've seen this again and again. But I also thought that these women have got to be fighting their own battles within their own army, because it's still a man's world. And what does that look like? And so all of those really intimate spaces that we encounter in life when we're, working with somebody, living with somebody in a common endeavor with groups of people, it started developing into really complicated and interesting ways for me, thinking about war.
Yeah. And you also said something quite important, that you didn't know whose story it was with your first manuscript. Do you think a lot of history is like that? Just a lot of facts following each other, a lot of battles following each other, until someone comes along and says, this is the story of Achilles, this is the story of Hirut, this is the story of Maaza. until someone with their own subjectivity comes and knocks the facts into some shape or form that drives a narrative. Is that what you think a lot of history is like? And then in that way as well, is that how do you think the West has structured history in their favor? Because all of these battles that you mentioned in Ethiopia happened, but at some point they came along and they knocked them into a particular story and decided this is our story now. Is that what you think a lot of stories are like? Just the facts until someone comes with their own subjectivity and says, this is the story I want to tell.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, that history is subjective. And what I understood reading the archives and doing research both on the Ethiopian side and also on the Italian side is that the first draft of history is often written by those who are in the majority, by those who hold the power. That first draft of history is the thing that we get as proper history. And now what's happening, and what has been happening, is that historians and other writers are coming and starting to chip away at that structure and saying, wait a minute, we need to revise, we need to edit this. Unfortunately, that first draft tends to be the thing that people and the world understand as the way it really happened. But it is, it's of course subjective. It reflects the biases of those people who were in power, who could rewrite and override certain aspects of that moment. It is completely subjective. And, even anyone that's doing this, I've had some historians tell me, I don't read fiction. What you're doing is so like anti-history that I'm not going to read it. And I've asked a few of them, what do you do when you don't know something and you are recording a historical event? I was talking with someone who's very well known for writing books on World War II, nonfiction books. And he just was irate at the fact that historical novelists are working the way that I'm working and other people are working. And I asked him, what do you do when you come up to something you don't know, when there's no information? And he said, well, I just skip it. And I said, that's a narrative. You've just crafted something. You can't say that what you do is the absolute truth. At least with fiction, we are jumping into those gaps and trying to form a better understanding of what's been avoided or forgotten. So historians are creating their own narratives. And I think that if you imagine every human being, which we all are fallible, if we are all fallible, if we are all biased in one way or another, then you can't tell me that historical narratives are not as biased as the people who created them. And that's when fiction can step in and begin to push against what we know.
Yeah. I mean, you also touched on something quite important when you said the women on the battlefield, it was also their war. And in a lot of ways, in The Shadow King, at the conclusion, I feel like the war was against the women, based on my reading of The Shadow King. Do you think then, in a lot of ways, war is never really it's always about men fighting men, but it's always about men targeting ultimately the end goal being the women? Because as you said, if you attack the women, you attack the men as well, but you also attack the future. So do you think then necessarily that the conception of war is, at least all of these historical battles that we've read, the War of Troy, the Second World War, the Great War, the German colonial war in Namibia, all of those things, aren't they actually tacit ways of like attacking the women? And then in yours, in The Shadow King, it's the first time the women are actually involved in the war and they're fighting back. I always think about that line when Asta says, we are more than this.
Yeah.
I feel like then all wars are actually about attacking the women and womanhood, because from that you attack, as you said, the future.
It's true. I mean, think about the ways that masculinity is defined on what is manly and what is womanly. There are these binaries. So if you do things that are manly and you can't do things that are womanly, women are women and men are men. And if war makes a man out of you, if war turns a boy into a man, what does that mean to definitions of masculinity as it relates to women? That war has always been a way to define manhood, to create heroes, to define courage, to define determination, all of these things which are modes of aggression. We imagine that as masculine. Women who are relegated to the home and do the work of continuing a community, continuing a lineage, continuing a heritage, creating a future, taking care of the community, those things aren't counted as heroic. It's the aggression. And aggression is seen as a kind of progress. If you're progressing, you're constantly moving into new territory. It's a forward movement. Caretaking is a circular movement. I don't know if this is making sense, but
it makes sense. Makes sense.
When we couple aggression with progress and we bind those together to manhood, it defines a way of being in the world. Women are never credited for the things they do, which is keeping up a family, keeping up a community, doing all these things that evolve as opposed to forward-moving progression. And that becomes feminine. And so when war is declared on something, what does an enemy do? But of course, go to the thing that continues a community, that is developing the well-being of a group of people, of families, of villages, and attack them. Because if you attack the women, you've disrupted society. You've disrupted that continuance, which means you're disrupting and breaking the path to a future. When we see history, we mark history by conflicts. We mark history by disruptions. We don't mark history in the work that women do to continue the future of a society, of a community. And that way of defining history already makes it masculine. And I think that, imagine these women getting into the front lines in their uniforms or in their dresses with their rifle and pointing a gun at an Italian who already has his own patriarchal views of the place of women. And now he's supposed to shoot at a woman? What kind of man does that make him? So the battle that's happening is multi-layered on that field. And, I have to say that I did a lot of research with, of course, in the archives, looking at what was happening in Ethiopia. But I took real inspiration from the liberation movements across Africa that were spearheaded often by women. The protests against colonialism, the protests against corruption, the protests against oppression that began and centered women across the continent and all these liberation movements. It's nothing new. Women, we've been here. But because we only think of aggression in terms of men, those women get forgotten as soon as that conflict is over.
So do you think in the act of writing The Shadow King, and with the book out and it having achieved such universal success, do you think you're going to see, or we're going to see, more narratives coming from the continent about the role of women in the liberation struggles from the continent, or protest actions wherever they might have been involved? Because a local example is that in our liberation struggle, women were an absolute important part of driving the most recent colonial power, being South Africa, of driving it out of Namibia. In the northern front lines, women in the communities were very important people because they either shielded soldiers or fed them or actively took part in combat. So do you think with The Shadow King having arrived and presenting readers with an a supplementary view of history, can we expect more writings of this nature from the continent, from African writers?
You know what, Remy? I think we definitely should expect it. I actually think some of these books have been written, and I wonder if they just didn't get interest. for one way or another. You know, this industry is fickle.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'm the only one or the first one to have written anything like this. I just think I was lucky enough to have a platform that launched this book. But I suspect that there are other writers who have been working and who have done books and stories like this.
Yeah.
I also think, and I'm really interested in finding those stories that center, you know, LGBTQ characters in these kinds of conflicts, in historical moments, because we know this also happened. I think they're out there. And I hope if there's anything that comes from this book, The Shadow King, getting a wider audience, I hope that means that readers are now more interested in looking for other stories that decenter, you know, this patriarchal male European reading of history.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's always hard to, find similar books or whatnot on these types because we have a pretty hard way of not established of archiving our history or our writings or whatnot. So there's always that feeling of like, am I the only one doing this thing?
Yeah.
Which is weird because if you think about writing in that historical context, and all of our books have always been socially distanced and quarantined and locked away from each other, and there's no dialogue about them, and that for me speaks to the world in which we are right now, where we're all locked away and we can't meet and whatnot. And so I'm definitely certain that you're not the first, but I think it's important to at least have a meeting point, and I feel like The Shadow King is a common watering hole. So well done on having done that for yourself and for other writers. It's important. A rallying point is a start. It's never the end, but it's a start. So congratulations on that. Yeah. And then we have to talk about like the chorus and the interludes, because I loved the structure of the novel. You know what? I think this whole novel was a flex. It was just like a literary flex. You are just like, I can do this, therefore I'm going to do it and prove me wrong. And there only one other writer I know or that I've read who has reached that level of flexation, as the youth call it, flexation. Marlon James. Marlon James wrote A Brief History of 7 Killings, and my gosh, that book was just like, I'm gonna do it because I can. And I feel like you reached that level with The Shadow King. And I say that on the backside, having read Beneath the Lion's Gaze, which some people would call, a more normal debut. And then The Shadow King is just, I'm gonna put in a chorus and interlude here. How did you arrive at the decision to have the choruses and the interludes, and most importantly, the photographs in the structure of them as a narrative tool? Yeah.
You know, it's really interesting you mentioned Marlon James, because Marlon and I were having conversations while I was writing this book and he was writing A Brief History of 7 Killings. And at some point we met, we were at a festival, and his deadline had already passed and my deadline had already passed, and we were talking about the books that we were working on and these different things we were trying. And his book got published, then eventually mine did, and when the book launched, we were both on stage talking about these conversations we'd had before. And one of the things that Marlon said to me just as my book was getting done, the one that I would finally submit to my editor, he said his book was a fuck you book. Like, fuck you, I'm going to do this. Fuck you, I can do this. And he said, Maaza, what's yours? I said, oh shit, Marlon, mine's a fuck you book too. And I'm going to do it. And so when we met on stage last year to talk about this, we were remembering this. Like, these were our fuck you books. No insult intended for the reader. It was really fuck you to the universe. Like, who says I can't do this? But for me, though, I feel like I got to that point because I felt like I had done what I thought I was supposed to do, and that draft was terrible. So I wanted to free myself from any kind of constraint and say, look, it can't get any worse than this thing. So why don't you just try something else? What do you really want to do? And I started thinking about the Greek tragedies. You and I have talked about how much we both love those. In Ethiopia, we have they're griots, they're troubadours. They sing with their instruments. They work in little bars. They know the village. They know the town in which they live. And people come in and they're making up songs. And, Remy, they'll look at somebody and go, your husband is having an affair with this one. They just lay it all out. And I was thinking in 1935, they're probably recording battles through song, these heroics, and doing all these things. They are a way to contain and continue memory. They are, Homer's use of the chorus is part of an ancient tradition of storytelling, and that storytelling tradition has always existed in Africa. It's not a Greek invention. Homer didn't invent it, he just copied it. And if Africans have been having these communications with ancient Greece, ancient Rome for millennia. So why wouldn't we have these things? If you look at the clothing that is, in Africa, you can see that the Greeks and Romans copied it. Because we are first. So why not? Why not do this? It's not Greek. It's mine. And I was thinking about you and I read with a group of people Agamemnon together, which was one of the best things during lockdown. I really think we need to do this again.
We should. We
should. And so what happened? And Agamemnon is one of my favorite tragedies. And in that, the chorus is coming in, and periodically they're looking at Clytemnestra or Cassandra. They're just saying, "Fam, we are tired. We're tired. Like, we don't like Clytemnestra, but we're tired. Like, we're done." And I wanted a voice that was working against a narrative that way. And the way that the Asmari in Ethiopia could come in and say, what you think is not true. Actually, this is what's going on.
Your chorus is feisty.
Your chorus is off. Yeah, they're really
feisty.
But
they often seem like what the films do this now with the breaking of the fourth wall, where they turn to you and they say, she's gonna do this, but actually this is what happened. And I absolutely love that part, that aspect of the chorus, like just breaking the rules clearly. And
that it was fun. This was the thing that I've spent so long on this book. I want to do something that I want to do, and I don't know if it's going to work. I haven't read this before, but fuck it. I'm going to do it. And I still keep a very small piece of paper. It's actually still on my computer. I don't know if you can read it. So I wrote this the day that I was starting on the next draft of The Shadow King. And it says, give yourself space to fail. And I said from the very beginning, I'm going to go all out. And if I fail, that failure will be dramatic and it will be spectacular. It's going to be a blowout, and I'm going to go all the way, and I will risk failure because I've already failed in this other draft. But I'm going to do it big this time instead of being scared and trying to second guess myself. And so that gave me the courage to do the chorus, to do these interludes. But the photographs were not only a way to risk something in this book, but I really wanted to tell the story of photography in the colonial enterprise in Africa and, in other countries that had faced violence and oppression from colonial forces. The way that colonial endeavors were justified was through the narrative that was created by photographs, images. You go in and you photograph people that look so different. And what you're doing is you're not creating a story about a human being. You're really just rendering a type without any depth.
Yeah.
It's just spectacle. And that justifies whatever violence happens. Because if you don't imagine someone is like you in any way, it's much easier to be cruel. Yeah, and I wondered how does that work in a novel about history when I really do consider photographs as another form of narrative in history. But I was really interested also in the fact that one of the characters that I put a camera in his hand, is Italian, of course, but he's also Jewish. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but there were eventually anti-Semitic laws that passed across Italy as this war is happening in Ethiopia. And so these Italian Jewish soldiers who were working for a racist colonial endeavor were eventually themselves subjected to that same bigotry. And I wondered what that would feel like for a character.
Yeah, and I've seen this in your own photography. You never take your subject head on. You're always often to the side or behind them or hidden or something. Is that a deliberate photography stance that you're taking, and then you also try to bring that into the narrative of the photos in The Shadow King?
That's really interesting you say that. There are photographers that do street photography where they literally get into somebody's face and shoot and then dart away, and they capture these things. I can't do that. It feels so invasive to me. I guess it's a political understanding beneath that photographs, I can't take them. I want to make them with somebody else. So often, if you see anyone in my photographs, I post a few online. Most of the time I've talked to them. Most of the time they're aware that I'm there. And I'm not trying to get in front and capture an expression that's unexpected, on their part. I'm not trying to take anything from them. They know I'm there. I've sometimes asked if I can photograph them, and I tell them, just do what you were doing, and then I can get somewhere where I would really like to be. Yeah. I'm just not that kind of photographer. I don't have that aggressiveness, but that is also problematic. It's a nature of photography. It has the same philosophy as explorers had when they were moving into Africa. You jump in front of something, you capture it. Photographers were sent into those countries, sent into Africa, sent into Asia, sent with no respect for the human beings that they were capturing on film. Yes. And I've often seen photography following the same path of aggression, of violation, of violence that we see in colonial administrators. And we see it now even with the photojournalists, these young white men who think of war as an adventure and a way to make their name. And so rather than being part of the community, sending someone that's a part of the community that these editors want to photograph, they'll parachute in a white man who goes in, knows nothing, captures, and then leaves.
Yeah.
That's colonial.
So it's, it is extractive in a lot of ways. It's very, very extractive photography. And I think you wrote about this for Africa as a country with the use of camera as a weapon, and it is extractive. My question is, if you know this about photography, and you know this about the colonial narrative and the colonial experiment and all of those things, how do you as a writer, how did you stop yourself from extracting these women's stories and narratives and then saying, here they are on the page, they're my story now, thank you very much? How do you still keep that dialogue going between these women's lives and their histories and being true to the history, but also leaving space for your fiction and not feeling like you got parachuted into an archive somewhere and you went and you pulled folders 3 to 5 and say, this is my book now? How do you stop that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think part of it is that I'm emotionally invested in this history just based on my own family history. It's not just a story for me. My family members fought and died in this war. My father's brothers were involved in this war, his cousins. You know, my great-grandmother enlisted in the war. I felt like these people were mine. I wasn't just writing about a group of people. I was writing about people that I felt a part of. And, you know, another thing is, I'm not sure if Hirut and Aster and these women I depict in the book, I'm not sure if I agree with everything that they do throughout the course of the story. Yeah. And that's also part of it, is giving them the freedom to do what they would do, as opposed to what I think would be an example of what I would do. Hilary Mantel once made a really interesting point of, if you're writing a book that's set in another period, you know, let's say she's writing the 1500s, Thomas Cromwell, or I think it was 1500s. She says, I can't apply 20th century norms or thinking to the way that women behaved in the 1500s. I've got to let them behave the way that they would behave based on their environment. And that's also the same thing that I had to do in this book with 35. I'm not enforcing anything. I'm exploring and examining what they were doing.
Yeah, and I think that's what gives me my sense of disturbance, because I'm approaching it with my 21st century sense of morality, of, you know, this is what it should be, this is wrong, this is right. But to be honest, I've never been in those kinds of desperate human situations where you're forced to make hard choices and whatnot. And I think as a writer, you know, I learned a lot from reading that from your book, and just learning to let go and let characters make their own choices, because I'm not sure I have the skill or the sensitivity to let them do some of the things that happen. Because I'm just, I guess, like you said, I'm only 2 years old, so like I've got to wait until I turn 22 before I can actually write this thing. And then I have another thing. I have concrete proof that you were actually, this is your fuck you book, and you were flexing on us the whole time. Interestingly, because we couldn't engage the audience in questions, we asked them to send in some of their queries. And one of them was Fifi Batef from Kenya. And she says she's curious to know about your choice for not using quotation marks. Is it purely for aesthetic purposes, or does it symbolize something, a reflection perhaps of the blurred lines between what is spoken and implied during wartime? And I'm glad that she asked this question, because as soon as I see someone drop punctuation marks, I'm like, oh my God, they're just about to flex with their whole English education on us. And you know, it's good that you admitted it. I didn't point it out, but there's only one other person who did this. Marlon James introduced me to the M dash as a way of using dialogue. It was just like, fuck your punctuation marks, bro. I don't care about your punctuation marks. So yeah, that's Fifi's question, and I was so glad that it tied into like this conversation. So yeah, I'd like to give you an opportunity to just reply to her.
Well, I wish we could roll back this tape about 3 seconds, because I want you to pay attention to exactly how you quoted Marlon James.
Yeah.
You didn't pause for quotation marks. You just told exactly what you think he said. Are you following me?
Yeah, I'm following you. Yeah.
When I was writing and I'm hearing the chorus, and I'm hearing these characters, they're not pausing for these quotation marks. There is a thread that connects thought to action in a way that it is undisturbed by these pauses.
Yeah.
And exactly the way that you just rendered Marlon speaking, and then you automatically come back to me. That's what I wanted to render, because this book is, in some ways, I imagined it like an opera, with the chorus coming in, with the interludes, with the segues into the photographs, and then the overarching narrative. I imagined it as a musical piece. I said, if this thing is being sung the way that the Iliad might have been, recited and sung over the centuries, there's no quotation mark. And, bless me, but at the end of this book, I went back and said, let me just put some quotation marks, because I can imagine the shit I'm about to hear.
Yeah.
And I went and I said, the chorus is it's not gonna happen. It just doesn't sound right. The rhythm of this, I wanted the reader to understand, in some ways, the way that Fifi said, the seamlessness between thought and action. This is war, but it's also, I was hearing this as a larger piece, and all of it actually would just have one quotation mark, because it's being performed. And I think that once you get into the rhythm of it, it moves, but I can imagine it being jarring. Yeah.
You know what? I don't think it's jarring, because when I read it, and it's wonderful that, we're having this three-way conversation about your work and Marlon James' work, because a lot of people said MJ's work was just disturbing for them because they couldn't read Jamaican patois and it's all in first person and it rambles, whatever. But when you hear it, the audiobook, you're like, this makes sense. And so I'm curious to know about The Shadow King when it does become an audiobook, or when it does become, Netflix, a big gladiator-esque film. I'm curious to see how they will interpret your approach to storytelling and making sure like the dialogue is part of an action. It links directly to a thought. It links directly to a description of the landscape, not this structural approach to writing where one paragraph of setting the scene, then a dialogue, then a thought, then back to the scene and whatever. I'm curious to see how they interpret and bring your vision or your storytelling to light. And I think that's one of the things about The Shadow King. Like, it's not jarring, it's a different experience. But if you've had some training, or you've read some Greek plays like you mentioned, or you're used to listening to music, and rappers do the same thing. You don't know where the narrative starts and where they're the real character, or where the beat ends and whatnot. And I thought you brought that up wonderfully together in The Shadow King. And that's why ultimately I'm telling you that you are just flexing on us. It was a flex. It was just a flex. It was just a flex.
Funny.
Yeah, but to be fair, nobody reaches your level of storytelling without many years of craft and dedication. So I have a question about how it'll be a long answer, but I want to shorten it as quickly as possible. With this book having achieved everything that it has, what keeps you now focused on the work? I mean, like, it's very simple to say, like, it's done, I'm finished. But what keeps you focused on the work as a writer?
I'm not done. As I was writing this book, I already had ideas developing for, at least one book. Maybe I think it might be turning out to be 2 books. I'm excited to do those. But the same way that I challenged myself to do something different in this book, I am challenging myself to do something completely different in the 3rd book. The 3rd book is not going to be a recreation of The Shadow King. The Shadow King was not a recreation of Beneath the Lion's Gaze. Part of writing is growing as a person, as a writer, as a thinker. And I know that I grew over the 10 years of writing this book, but I still have a lot to do. I still have a lot to read. I still have a lot to learn. And reading for me is a form of education. So I'm excited about that, because it's a challenge, and I'm excited to see what comes next. So I'm not done. It's just that I developed some muscle and battle scars in this one, and it's now time to move on to the next thing. And I want to, again, give myself room to fail. I want to push that. That's
Yeah.
just that's how I want to do it.
Yeah, no, I like how you're phrasing it, like push yourself and give yourself room to fail. And I don't know whether you remember, but in an Afrolit session with Sisonke Simang, she said one of her things that she does when she approaches writing is that she has the internal confidence that she's a good writer and that she can. And once she becomes comfortable within a skill set, she can go out and do the work. And so I have a question. If the women in the Shadow King were denied from taking part in a war and battles that directly affected them, you as a female writer, as Maaza Mengiste, do you also wake up in the literary establishment with that same primal aggression that male writers are allowed to have and say, I am going to shape the world in my image, I'm going to win the Nobel, I'm going to do X, Y, Z, and the other? Do you feel like you're also now allowed to have those same things and say, I'm going to be the greatest writer ever? And it's a thing that you can own and say, I am going to do this. Because guys are allowed to do it, and they have been allowed to forever. And so, do you now, as well, having written something like The Shadow King, and just with your skill and craft, do you also have those entitlements? Can we call them entitlements? Yeah, those things. Urges. I don't know. Yeah.
It's interesting that you're saying that. I think a male writer can say, I'm a damn good writer, and people are like, yeah, he must be, but if a woman says it, and if a Black woman says it, if an African woman says it, it has to be tempered by, well, for an African writer, for a female writer, for an Ethiopian writer, it has to be tempered, whereas the white male can be universal in their arrogance. And I know that I wrote a damn good book, and I know that I'm a talented writer. I know I'm a fucking talented writer. I can say that, and I can say that without any hesitation. I'm not the only talented writer. Yeah. I'm not the only one who's written a fucking great book. There are great books still being written right now. They're, whether on the continent or in the diaspora, they are there. There are writers out there that are fucking amazing, and they are more amazing than most of these writers that get accolades.
Yeah.
The key is, what can we do, those of us who have a platform, to begin to widen the base? Because there are some fantastic writers out there. You and I have talked about this. We've seen it. You're an amazing writer. These accolades we're grateful and lucky to have them, but I was the writer I was, while I was writing The Shadow King. I was still there, and I still knew that I could do it. I just needed to overcome my own hesitations. It's not lack of talent. So yeah, we need to be declaring this. Tsitsi Dangaremba is also on the Booker shortlist. Yeah. Man, there's no tokenism happening here. There were other great books that may not have made that list, some of my favorite writers, but we're here. It's in some ways a declaration by the judges that we're not going to pick just one African because, this is what you should do, and you start picking the other things that make you more comfortable. It's interesting. It's interesting to see the backlash that's happening, and because Hilary Mantel did not get on that list, and I love her. I admire her work so much. I have my confidences. Confidence. I am a talented writer. I am really good. Am I the best I can be? No, and that's the excitement of it. Is that I will continue to push myself through the next several books and essays and short stories and whatever else I do. But it's an exciting place to be right now. And it's exciting. But, Knausgaard can write his 3,000 page thing that's constantly focused on his navel. Yeah, I want like an African to do this. I want the Black woman to say, fuck you. You're gonna read volumes of my life, and I'm gonna make it boring because I can do it.
You can use all those books as yoga blocks. That's how big they are.
Actually, I should. But
they're so big.
I wish I had kept it.
Oh, you went further than I did. I got as far as the first one, and then I got tired. I was like, oh Lord, no. But on the other hand, I totally agree with what you said about, white males are allowed to become masters of the universe, but black people, black women, African women always have to qualify things all the time. And I feel like I don't think that's fair and I don't think that's right. So I'm glad that you came out and said it, because I think in acknowledging your talent, you also give other people the power to acknowledge theirs. And it'll be interesting to see what work is inspired by Maaza in the coming days. I mean, I'm definitely inspired. Like, I'm flexing in the next thing that I write, for sure. I'm dropping. I am leaving full stops behind. Full stops are a patriarchal construction. But
why not? Why not? I mean, there have been writers who've written, 8 pages and it's one sentence, and people are saying, "Oh my God, this is the greatest thing." But why not do that? If it works, do it. And this is the thing, is that when you're accepted by an industry, when the industry reflects you have a lot less hurdles to jump in order to be experimental. But this idea that African writers can't experiment with structure and voice and different forms of literary devices the way that other writers can, like who said we can't? Because that is supposed to be foreign to us. We are not supposed to invent. We're simply supposed to survive. We need to turn that table around, because we are inventors also.
No, we are, and we always have been. I don't think it's acknowledged enough, and I think we need to reclaim that. And one of the ways we're definitely reclaiming it is the narrative of African time. I've always hated that phrase of African time, because it's always been negative, and it's always been used as like, oh, look, you're late, definitely African time, and whatever. And I think it was Zukiswa Warner who said this in her Afrolit session, that we judge time by events and not when they're supposed to start. So it's like, did the thing happen? So it's like, if the wedding started late, it's not that it started late. The more important question was, did the wedding happen? And if it happened, then what's the point of complaining about it? So with us, with this theme of African time at Ake this year, I wanted to just, thank you for having had the courage years ago to conceptualize the story and to having had the skill to bring it to paper. Because now in 2020, in this strange period of lockdown, of isolation and whatnot, we can say that we judge 2020 by the great events that have happened. And one of them is the Shadow King.
Thank you so much, Remy. It was really, really a pleasure talking to you. What is time?
What is time? It's a patriarchal construction created by the bourgeoisie to put the proletariat in their place. And so, fuck minutes, fuck seconds, fuck hours.
That's right. Fuck GMT.
We'll definitely look back on 2020 and think about it as the first year that, Ake went online and digital. But we'll definitely look back at this time as the year in which the Shadow King not only achieved the success, but you also were brought to like a broader audience and platforms. And we're all looking forward to like your next works. And we wish you strength, determination, and courage. In the words of Maximus Decius Meridius, strength and honor.
Honor.
Strength and honor.
Thank you so much, Remy. Everyone should be looking for your work and your book that will soon be launching. I cannot wait for that.
Thank you, Maaza. We appreciate it, and thanks for making this time. And I have to send a special thank you for Lola Shonin for making Ake, for making Ake possible, and for including me in this conversation with you. Platforms like Ake are absolutely important because they just bring African writers together, and we learn from each other, we encounter each other, and that's important for me specifically, from as a writer from Namibia, which doesn't have which doesn't have the most well-known literary tradition. It's just great to be invited and to be a part of it. And then the last thing I have to tell you, this is where I try to do my great master of the universe and click things together. I'm going to fail, but I've tried, and I thought about this, and I spent all evening on Wikipedia trying to see if my theory holds water. So you and MJ wrote The Shadow King and Brief History of Seven Killings within like a rough period of each other. His came out first, and then The Shadow King came out. He won the Booker in 2015. You're shortlisted for it this year. You know, similar experimental styles, both fuck you books. And Brief History is about, in a lot of ways, about the Rastafari who were influenced by Haile Selassie, who was the emperor of Ethiopia. And Ethiopia was the first country to petition the United Nations for Namibia's independence. So there's like this weird link between all these literatures that I've been introduced to. And I'm like, there's like a weird link between Ethiopia and then Jamaica. And then I guess in some ways, Namibia and the things that I'm interested in writing and reading about. And then this is just my way of saying that I should be included in your WhatsApp group. Like, we need 3 people.
I think so. I think we absolutely do. We're going to make that happen.
No, but there's like all of these weird links between Ethiopia and Jamaica, and then Ethiopia and Namibia. Yeah. And, you know, the Ethiopian immigrant community is also very established here in Namibia. And immediately after the state of emergency was ended, Ethiopia Airlines was the first one to resume flights here. So, yeah, the very first one. And so they're like the only people were flying in and out of Namibia. So Namibia and Ethiopia have been having connections. So I thought that was just weird.
So interesting. I just finished a book. It doesn't have an Ethiopian connection, except I'm the one reading it, but it's coming out soon. It's called Afterlives, and it's about the German colonial. It's a novel about German colonial presence in East Africa, but also goes through some parts of Namibia, present day Namibia, and it was fascinating, Remy. So this literature is happening. All over, but people are becoming more aware of Namibia thanks to you, thanks to the King Prize. I think these conversations, this is what happens when more and more writers begin to do this work. It shifts what we think of as world history.
Yeah. And even your research within the Italian archives for Ethiopian history, I think it'll encourage more of us over here as well to go back to the German colonial archives, the histories, the museums over here, to not only delve for our own stories and find interesting ways to tell them. But we only need one of us to make it, and then the rest of us are encouraged. And so thanks for leading the way.
Well, I'm following other people, but thank you.
Thank you. But that's how you make a chain. One person has to follow another, and then so forth and so on. And thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Remy.
If you ever need a new place to go, you can join me in a world of words. When it seems like I'm nowhere to be found, if you look, you'll find me in a book. Let's take a ride to the past in the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon. You'll never be alone, now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the word in a book. You'll never be alone, now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the word in a book.
We don't just think of ourselves as a bank. We think of ourselves as corporate citizens with responsibility for growing the economy. reading and education is a key part of it. But equally important is having access to reading materials at home. A lot of the intervention we've done throughout this COVID is to ensure that people can safely navigate the uncertainties of the COVID crisis and come out of it ready for, to live again.
Let's take a ride to the past in the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon.
The dreams that we have are limited by what we have directly interacted with. What reading does is it makes it possible for you to begin to live in worlds that don't yet exist. One read creates a discipline of reading. One read puts me on the timeline. It gives me an important book and I have an opportunity to read it and to collaborate. It's almost like having someone who does your book selection for you. If you have editors and people who are really good at this saying to you, this is the book for the month, I value that. I want to be able to read in a community. I want reading to be a collaborative thing. I want reading to be a communing, and One Read allows me to do that. I will use One Read any day, anytime.
Stranger's Guide is not a typical American travel magazine. Our mission is to dive deep into a single location, commissioning work from great writers and photographers, famous individuals, as well as up-and-coming new voices. This year, we decided to go to Lagos. And we are proud of the volume we produced, with original work from some of Nigeria's best writers and photographers, working with luminaries like Wale Soyinka, Molara Wood, and Femi Kuti. We think this is a very special volume, and we're so excited to bring it back to Lagos.
Sticky, spicy, sweet.
I want to go there.
Don't touch me. I will get you arrested. Very, very easy. Relax, everybody!
He shot you!
That 5 minutes madness only you can understand. Visit myspectre.com to get your Spectre experience. Spectre, loans in 5 minutes.